I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to spend this quiet time with you. Share with us where you're listening from, and what is your favourite kind of tea. Be sure to subscribe so you can return for a new mystery every day. Now let the story unfold. Chapter 1. Steam. Rising from the Teapot. The village of St. Mary Mead had a way of conducting its summers with great propriety. The roses bloomed along the cottage walls in a manner almost too orderly to be natural. The hedgerows were trimmed with quiet precision, and the inhabitants themselves seemed to arrange their days according to some unwritten, but universally observed code of seasonal behaviour. One lunched at the proper hour, one called upon neighbours in the afternoon, and one attended Mrs. Eleanor Mayhew's Thursday gatherings as surely as one attended church on Sunday, with a similar mixture of genuine comfort and mild social obligation. Miss Jane Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to understand all of this perfectly. She was a small, upright woman of considerable years, with white hair worn in neat waves beneath a sensible hat, and eyes of a pale, attentive blue that had a disconcerting habit of noticing everything. She knitted, she gardened, she listened, and she thought. It was, many had found, a rather formidable combination. On the second Thursday of June, she made her way along Vicarage Lane towards Mayhew House, at the customary hour of 3:30. The afternoon was warm and still, with the faint scent of cut grass drifting from the direction of the rectory, and the distant sound of bees going about their purposeful work among the lavender. It was, by any measure, a pleasant day for a gathering. Mayhew House was a solid Edwardian property set somewhat back from the lane, behind a garden that was the source of much local admiration. Mrs. Eleanor Mayhew had lived there for nearly 30 years, first as the wife of the late Mr. Gerald Mayhew, a prosperous man of business who had died quietly of a heart complaint some 9 years past, and subsequently as its mistress in her own right. She was a woman of perhaps 62, with a carefully arranged appearance that spoke of standards firmly maintained. Her hair was silver and immaculate, her dress invariably suitable, and her manner one of composed authority. She ran her household with efficiency, her garden with devotion, and her Thursday gatherings with the precision of a seasoned general directing modest but well-executed campaigns. The drawing-room, into which Miss Marple was shown by the housemaid Agnes, was already pleasantly occupied, so as 3 or 4 guests had arrived before her, and were arranged about the room in the natural clusters that form at such occasions. A low fire burned in the grate, unnecessary in June, but Mrs. Mayhew considered it hospitable, and upon the long table near the window stood the tea things, the large silver teapot, the matching sugar basin, the jug of hot water, the plates of thin sandwiches and small cakes, and the cups in their delicate white and blue pattern that Miss Marple had always privately admired. She settled herself in her usual chair near the fireplace, slightly to one side and slightly behind the general assembly, which offered an excellent view of the room without demanding that she occupy its centre. It was a position she had found congenial for many years. Colonel Arthur Brentwood arrived some 10 minutes after Miss Marple. He was a large, florid man of 70 or thereabouts, recently retired from a distinguished if quietly spent military career, who had returned to St. Mary Mead, the village of his early years, some 3 summers ago. He moved with the deliberate solidity of a man accustomed to being the most substantial person in any room, and took the chair nearest the window with the air of one occupying strategic ground. He had a daughter, Miss Cecily Brentwood, who accompanied him that afternoon, a composed young woman of perhaps 30, with her father's directness of manner considerably softened by her mother's intelligence. Miss Cecily had a habit of watching people without appearing to do so, which was a quality Miss Marple found instinctively sympathetic. The other guests comprised Mrs. Dorothy Harker, the wife of the local solicitor and a woman of great conversational energy. Mr. Edwin Clark, a mild-mannered solicitor who had offices in the village and had served various local families in professional capacity for a good many years, and Mrs. Winifred Clark, his wife, a quiet, somewhat watchful woman whose opinions, when she expressed them, had a precision that suggested many hours of private reflection. The conversation moved through its usual channels with unhurried ease. The state of the rose beds in the churchyard was discussed. The planned restoration of the village hall was touched upon and laid gently aside. Mrs. Harker offered an account of her niece's recent engagement that occupied several minutes most agreeably. Throughout, Agnes moved with the careful efficiency of a well-trained housemaid, filling cups and offering plates with the silent competence that Mrs. Mayhew required of her household. Miss Marple accepted her tea, Indian as she preferred, with a small amount of milk, and listened. She had long since ceased to feel any need to contribute to conversations when observation seemed more profitable. The gathering had its own comfortable rhythm, and she was content to allow it to proceed. It was perhaps 20 minutes after the Colonel's arrival that the disturbance occurred. It was not dramatic. There was no sudden cry, no overturned cup, nothing that the assembled company might afterwards have said constituted an event of significance. Colonel Brentwood simply set down his teacup, Earl Grey, which Agnes had confirmed was his standing preference, and pressed one large hand to his chest, blinking twice with an expression of confused displeasure. "I beg your pardon," he said, to no one in particular, feeling rather off. Mrs. Mayhew glanced across the room with an expression Miss Marple noted but filed carefully away. It was not the expression of a hostess alarmed by a guest's sudden indisposition, which would have been entirely natural. It was something quicker and more considered, a brief tightening about the eyes, a fractional pause before the appropriate response arrived. "Colonel, do sit back. Agnes, fetch a glass of water." There was a general murmur of concern. Mrs. Harker suggested it might be the heat. Mr. Clark remarked pleasantly that the Colonel had perhaps been overexerting himself in the garden. Miss Cecily moved to her father's side with quiet swiftness, and took his wrist lightly between her fingers. "Are you in pain?" she asked him, her voice low. "Nausea," the Colonel said shortly. "And the most extraordinary bitter taste. That tea was sharp as anything." He regarded the offending cup with an expression of dignified reproach. "Earl Grey can be quite strong," Mrs. Clark offered from across the room. "Some blends have a rather pronounced flavour." The Colonel made a sound that indicated he had been drinking Earl Grey for 40 years, and considered himself a reliable authority on the subject. He accepted the glass of water Agnes brought, drank from it, and after a few minutes declared himself recovered sufficiently to be going on. He remained another quarter of an hour, during which he spoke little, and held himself with the careful stillness of a man who is not quite comfortable, but declines to make further mention of it. When the Colonel and his daughter had taken their leave, the gathering resumed its gentle course, and the incident was absorbed into the ordinary matter of the afternoon with remarkable smoothness. Miss Marple did not resume her knitting immediately. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking at the table where the tea things stood. Agnes had begun clearing them away with her customary efficiency, carrying the cups on their tray towards the kitchen. One cup, however, had been set aside. It stood upon the sideboard nearest the door, not upon the tray with the others, not in the ordinary progress of clearing, but apart, placed there with a deliberateness that might easily have been mistaken for accident. Mrs. Mayhew was speaking to Mrs. Harker with every appearance of attention, her back half turned to the sideboard. She did not look at the cup, which was, Miss Marple reflected, something. It was a small detail. It might have meant nothing at all. A housemaid sometimes set items aside for any number of ordinary reasons. A cup might be cracked, or simply forgotten, or placed there by any hand during the general movement of the afternoon. And yet, Miss Marple had spent a long life in a small village, and she had observed, over the course of that life, that the smallest deviations from established habit were frequently the most informative. Mrs. Mayhew was not a woman who left things upon sideboards. Her household moved with a trained precision that was the product of years of attention. A single cup set aside and left, while the remainder of the tea things were collected and removed, that was not absence of mind. That was something else entirely. She accepted a second cup of Indian tea from Agnes, remarked pleasantly to Mrs. Clark that the garden was looking particularly well this year, and allowed the afternoon to proceed in its proper course. But she did not, for the remainder of her visit, entirely cease thinking about the Colonel's cup standing alone upon the sideboard, and the expression she had seen very briefly in Mrs. Eleanor Mayhew's eyes. Chapter 2. A Porcelain Cup Set Aside. The morning after Mrs. Mayhew's Thursday gathering arrived in the manner of all English June mornings, with a mild optimism that stopped just short of warmth, and a sky of that particular pale blue which suggests fair weather without committing to it entirely. Miss Marple was in her garden by 7:30, attending to the sweet peas with a pair of small scissors and the unhurried application of long experience. She'd slept well, as she generally did, but her first waking thoughts had returned, with the quiet persistence she'd come to recognise in herself, to the matter of Colonel Brentwood's cup. It was not, she reflected, snipping a spent bloom and laying it in the trug at her feet, that there was anything to be called a case. A gentleman had felt unwell at an afternoon gathering. Such things happened regularly, and to men of the Colonel's age and constitution more regularly still. Nausea after tea was, on the face of things, the most ordinary of domestic inconveniences, and yet the cup had been set aside. She considered this as she worked her way along the row of sweet peas, pausing now and then to tie a wandering stem back against its support. The previous evening she had mentioned nothing to anyone. There was nothing as yet to mention. She had simply observed and thought, and allowed the matter to settle in the manner of tea leaves sinking gradually to the bottom of a pot, which process, in Miss Marple's experience, frequently produced clearer results than any amount of agitated stirring. It was shortly before 11 that morning when she received a visitor. Miss Cecily Brentwood came to the front gate with the directness of a person who has made up her mind to do something and is not inclined to waste time in the doing of it. She was dressed with the same neat practicality Miss Marple had observed at Mrs. Mayhew's, a sensible blue costume, good walking shoes, no unnecessary ornament, and she carried a small basket with the air of someone who has provided herself with a plausible reason for calling, while being perfectly aware that the reason is largely ceremonial. "Miss Marple," she said, once they were settled in the sitting-room with the inevitable additional pot of tea. Miss Marple had developed a private theory that a great deal of English social life was conducted under the protective cover of tea, which allowed people to say things they might otherwise have found rather difficult. "I hope I'm not intruding. I've brought some runner beans from Father's kitchen garden. Agnes mentioned last week that yours had suffered in the late frost." "How very thoughtful," Miss Marple said, accepting the basket with genuine pleasure. The runner beans were excellent. "And how is the Colonel this morning?" Cecily set down her cup with a small, considered movement. "He's quite recovered, thank you. He says so himself, and the doctor says so as well. I telephoned Dr. Aldridge first thing, though Father was not at all pleased about it. He considers calling a doctor before breakfast to be a form of domestic panic, and entirely unsuitable." She paused. "He ate a large breakfast, which I took as a favourable sign." Miss Marple smiled gently at this. "And yet you came to me rather than to Dr. Aldridge with whatever is on your mind." Cecily looked at her steadily. She had, Miss Marple thought, very good eyes, clear, direct, and rather harder to deceive than she probably allowed most people to suspect. "You were watching everything yesterday afternoon," she said without accusation. "I noticed. Father notices very little that does not directly concern himself, which is a quality common to men of his particular type and generation, and I mean that quite affectionately. But I noticed you." "I have a habit of watching," Miss Marple agreed. "It is one of the less strenuous occupations available to someone of my age, and on the whole considerably more informative than conversation." "Father said the tea tasted bitter." Cecily folded her hands in her lap with a precision that suggested she was, in small ways, choosing her words much as she chose her movements, carefully and with deliberate intent. Not simply strong. He was quite specific about it. He said it tasted as it does when one has taken a quinine tablet and not quite managed to swallow it properly, so that the taste lingers. He's had reason to know that particular flavour. He was in India for some years, you understand." Miss Marple said nothing, which was frequently more productive than saying something. "And the curious thing," Cecily continued, her voice quite even, "is that no one else at the gathering mentioned any difficulty with the tea. Mrs. Harker, who I happened to encounter this morning at the post office, described the afternoon as perfectly delightful, and the refreshments as very good indeed. She did not appear to have experienced anything unusual. The Earl Grey is rather a distinctive blend," Miss Marple offered, in a tone that committed her to nothing. "So Mrs. Clark suggested yesterday." A brief pause followed this, of the kind that indicates a remark has been heard, considered, and not entirely accepted. "I returned to Mrs. Mayhew's briefly yesterday evening, on the pretext of having left my gloves. I had not, in fact, left my gloves, but I wished to see whether the cup was still there." Miss Marple looked at her with a mild expression that contained, had Cecily known her better, a considerable degree of respect. "And was it?" It was. Agnes had been about her work throughout the afternoon, and the tea things had long since been washed and put away. But Father's cup was still there, on the sideboard by the door, just as it had been when I noticed it about 4:30. Cecily met Miss Marple's gaze directly. "I should have thought in an efficiently run household that a single stray cup would have been attended to within minutes of the guest departing." "Mrs. Mayhew," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "does pride herself on very thorough housekeeping." "She does. Agnes told me. She seemed a little uncertain about mentioning it, poor girl, but she's not naturally evasive, that Mrs. Mayhew had told her specifically to leave that cup for the moment. Those were her exact words," Agnes said. "For the moment." Cecily allowed this to rest between them for several seconds. "I do not wish to make something of nothing. Father is well, the doctor has found no cause for concern, and yesterday was a warm afternoon after a tiring week. There may be a perfectly unremarkable explanation for all of this." "There usually is," Miss Marple agreed. "And yet one does sometimes wonder about perfectly unremarkable explanations, whether they have arrived at their unremarkableness naturally, or whether they have been encouraged towards it by some other means." This was the sort of remark that another person might have found rather oblique. Cecily, however, appeared to find it quite satisfactory. She nodded once, took up her teacup, and regarded the middle distance in the manner of someone thinking something through to its proper conclusion. "Father rarely takes sugar," she said after a moment. "He gave it up 8 or 9 years ago on the doctor's advice. He has been quite firm about it since. Yesterday, however, he accepted a spoonful from the basin without any apparent hesitation and without any comment." She set down her cup. "I only noticed it in retrospect. At the time I was speaking to Mrs. Clark and simply registered it as slightly unexpected. It is the kind of thing one notes without quite examining." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment, looking at the sweet peas she had brought in from the garden and arranged in a small vase on the mantelpiece. They stood in modest, colourful rows, each one exactly itself, no two quite alike. She thought about habits, which were a form of self-expression, and about the way in which a man who had refused sugar for nearly a decade would not, in the ordinary run of things, accept it without comment in a room full of acquaintances. Unless, of course, the sugar were not quite the thing he had been offered. "How very kind of you to bring the runner beans," she said to Cecily with warm finality. "I am sure your father will be quite himself again within a day or two. These little indispositions do pass, but perhaps," she added, folding her knitting back into its bag with the unhurried care of someone who intends to pick it up again quite soon, "you might let me know if he remembers anything further about the flavour of the tea." Cecily rose and gathered her things with the contained composure of a woman who has accomplished precisely what she came to accomplish. "Of course," she said, "and thank you, Miss Marple." The gate clicked shut behind her. Miss Marple remained in her chair a little longer, her hands resting lightly in her lap, thinking about cups set aside and sugar accepted without remark, and the precise wording of an instruction that a careful housemaid had been given and seen no reason to forget. Small deviations, she had always found, were not, as a rule, small at all. Chapter 3. The Guest Who Declined Lemon. There was in St Mary Mead a particular kind of morning, occurring most reliably in the middle weeks of June, when the village seemed to arrange itself with special care, as though conscious of being observed at its best. The post office stood with its door propped open. The bakers displayed a tray of particularly successful Victoria sponges in its small window. Elderly gentlemen walked their dogs with an air of serene possession, and the flower borders along the high street achieved that brief concentrated perfection that comes once a season and lasts, if one is fortunate, for a fortnight. Miss Marple moved through this agreeable scene on the Friday morning with her shopping basket and her customary expression of benign attentiveness. She had 2 or 3 small errands to attend to, and she attended to them at a pace that might have appeared leisurely to an observer, but was, in fact, precisely calibrated. There was a difference which Miss Marple had always appreciated between moving slowly and moving with intention. The tortoise, she had occasionally remarked to her niece, did not dawdle. It simply knew exactly where it was going and considered haste an unnecessary expenditure. She had been thinking, since Cecily Brentwood's visit, about Mr. Edwin Clark. He was a man whom saint. Mary Mead had long since absorbed into its settled fabric, the sort of figure who had been present at every local occasion for so many years that one ceased eventually to look at him directly and simply registered his presence as part of the general arrangement, like the church tower or the war memorial. He was somewhere in his middle 60s, with a slight careful build and hair that had been grey for so long that no one could reliably recall what colour it had been before. His manner was invariably pleasant, his conversation professionally neutral on all subjects of consequence, and his opinions expressed only in the most provisional of terms, as befitted a man who had spent his working life understanding that other people's secrets were not his own to dispense with freely. He had, for some 30 years, managed the legal affairs of a considerable number of local families, and including, and this was the detail that Miss Marple found herself returning to with some regularity, those of the late Mr. Gerald Mayhew, and by natural extension, those of his widow. At Mrs. Mayhew's gathering on Thursday, Mr. Clark had declined lemon in his tea. This was the sort of observation that would have meant nothing whatsoever to the majority of the assembled company, who had their own conversations to attend to and no particular reason to monitor the tea preferences of a mild-mannered solicitor. But Miss Marple had noticed it, because she had been quietly cataloguing small departures from the expected, and because she had, on 2 or 3 previous occasions at similar gatherings, observed Mr. Clark requesting lemon with the mild firmness of a man who considers it rather important. He had, in fact, on a Tuesday afternoon, some 3 weeks earlier at the Harkers, where Miss Marple had also been present, asked Agnes, who had been lent for the occasion, whether the lemon was sufficiently fresh, and expressed courteous but discernible disappointment when informed there was only bottled. It was a small thing, but it was characteristic. On Thursday, when Agnes had brought the lemon around, Mr. Clark had placed his hand briefly over his cup and said, "Not today, thank you. Simply a change." His voice had been perfectly pleasant. His expression had been perfectly ordinary, and yet his eyes in the moment before he offered that easy explanation had moved, just once, and very briefly, to where Mrs. Mayhew stood at the far end of the table. Miss Marple had been watching Mrs. Mayhew at the time as it happened, and had therefore observed this glance from its destination rather than its source. Mrs. Mayhew had been occupied with the sandwiches and had given no sign of noticing it. But the glance itself had been of a particular quality, not hostile, not affectionate, but measured. The look of a man, Miss Marple thought, who was keeping an account. She found him, as she had hoped she might, outside Thorpe and Son, the ironmonger's, where he was examining a display of garden implements with the detached consideration of a man who is not entirely sure what he wants but is in no hurry to decide. He greeted her with the pleasant formality he extended to all his acquaintances, and fell quite naturally into step beside her when she moved on along the pavement. "I trust Thursday's little upset has not cast a shadow," he said, after they had exchanged the usual remarks about the weather and the rose beds. Colonel Brentwood is quite recovered, I understand. Quite recovered, yes, Miss Marple said. It was a warm afternoon, and the Colonel is not, one suspects, as sedentary as his doctor might prefer. These things pass. She allowed a small pause to settle comfortably between them, though his daughter mentioned that he found the tea rather unusually sharp. He has strong views on Earl Grey. Mr. Clark made a sound of polite sympathy. Men of the Colonel's generation often do. There is a school of thought that considers the bergamot in lesser blends quite excessive. He spoke with the ease of a man discussing something entirely unremarkable, but his walking pace, Miss Marple noticed, had slowed by the smallest fraction. "Do you take lemon in yours ordinarily?" she asked in a tone of such complete social innocuousness that the question might have appeared to have no origin whatsoever beyond general conversational interest. He looked at her for a moment. Mr. Clark was, Miss Marple reflected, an intelligent man, which made him in certain respects more interesting to speak to, and in others rather more careful. "I do, as a rule," he said. "On Thursday I found I didn't want it. Tastes are variable things." "They are," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "I have a neighbour, well, a former neighbour, she has since removed to Dorset, who for 20 years took her tea without milk and then one summer simply stopped. No explanation. I always thought it said something rather interesting about her, though I could never quite determine what. This was, strictly speaking, true, and it served its purpose." Mr. Clark smiled with genuine amusement, and the slight increase in alertness she had observed in him eased by 1 degree. "Mrs. Mayhew's gatherings are always well managed," he said after a moment, in a tone that was almost entirely neutral. "She's an excellent hostess." "She is," Miss Marple said. "I have always admired the way she maintains her standards. Gerald Mayhew was a fortunate man in that respect. One imagines the household was run with equal attention during his lifetime." "Oh, quite," Mr. Clark said. "Gerald was a man who appreciated an orderly establishment." Something moved in his expression, not much, and not for long, at the mention of the late Mr. Mayhew. It was the particular expression of a person who has thought about someone recently, and not entirely warmly. "He had his qualities," he added, with the careful fairness of a man who's made a point of being fair even when it does not come naturally. Miss Marple stopped to admire a display of antirrhinums outside the florist's, giving Mr. Clark the option of stopping with her or proceeding, and was interested to note that he stopped. He had, she thought, not quite finished with the conversation, though he had perhaps not entirely decided what he wished to say next. "You have known the Mayhews a long time," she observed, examining the antirrhinums with apparent absorption. "A great many years," he said. "Since before Gerald's marriage, in fact. I handled the conveyancing when they purchased Mayhew House." He paused. "One accumulates these long associations in a village. They become part of the landscape." His tone was reflective, but there was something beneath the reflection. A sediment, Miss Marple thought. Yet that had been there for some time and had not, for all its long settlement, entirely lost its weight. She chose 2 bunches of antirrhinums, one pink, one a deep russet, paid for them, and tucked them into her basket. "It must make for a great deal of continuity," she said. "Though continuity has its complications, I always think. When one has known people across many years, one accumulates rather a lot of context." "Indeed one does," Mr. Clark said quietly. They parted at the corner of the High Street with every appearance of mutual goodwill, and Miss Marple walked home by the longer route, past the church and the old mill pond, where a pair of ducks conducted their affairs with complete indifference to the complications of human association. She thought about Mr. Clark's eyes moving to Mrs. Mayhew before he covered his cup. She thought about the particular quality of a man who says simply a change, when change is not, in fact, what he means at all, and she thought about the way he had spoken of Gerald Mayhew, with the careful fairness of someone who has had occasion to practice it over a considerable number of years, until it has become almost convincing. Almost. Chapter 4. Conversations Beneath the Wisteria. Saturday in St. Mary Mead had its own distinct character, quite unlike the purposeful weekday mornings, or the composed repose of Sunday. It was a day of intermissions, of gardens visited without appointment, of conversations conducted over garden walls, of small tasks undertaken without urgency and interrupted without regret. The village moved through its Saturday with a kind of collective ease, as though the week had been a garment worn rather stiffly, and this was the afternoon one was permitted at last to sit in something comfortable. Miss Marple spent the earlier part of the morning attending to correspondence and a small matter of mending, and then, after luncheon, put on her second-best hat and took herself out for a constitutional. The route she chose, and it was chosen with the deliberateness she generally brought to routes taken on foot, passed along the lane that ran behind Mayhew House, and continued past the old boundary wall of the property, where the wisteria had been established for so many decades that it had long since ceased to be a climber, and had become, rather, a permanent architectural feature in its own right. The wisteria was past its full bloom by mid-June, but it retained a diffuse, lingering fragrance, and the wall beneath it provided, on warm afternoons, a sheltered and not entirely inconvenient place to pause and rest. Miss Marple paused there now, ostensibly to retie a bootlace that required no retying, and was rewarded almost immediately by the sound of voices from the other side of the wall. She did not strain to listen. The voices came to her quite naturally, carried on the still afternoon air, and, if their owners chose to hold a conversation in a garden that shared a wall with a public lane, the responsibility for any audience so created rested surely with the speakers rather than the incidental hearer. This was a principle Miss Marple had always found logically satisfactory. The voices were those of Mrs. Winifred Clark, and a woman whose accent and manner suggested one of the newer arrivals to the village. Miss Marple believed her name was Mrs. Rudd, a widow who had taken a cottage in Orchard Road the previous autumn and had not yet been entirely absorbed into the established social arrangements. Mrs. Clark, it appeared, had called upon Mrs. Mayhew and was now making her way home through the garden by the side gate, having encountered Mrs. Rudd there in passage. The conversation had, by the time it reached Miss Marple's ears, reached a point of some particular interest. Had proposed the arrangement quite formally, Mrs. Clark was saying in her precise, unhurried way. Edwin brought it to Brentwood himself, which was not, I think, the wisest approach in retrospect. The Colonel is a man who prefers to feel that he has arrived at a decision himself, rather than having it presented to him fully formed. It is a not uncommon disposition in men who have spent their careers giving orders rather than receiving proposals. There was a dry precision to this last remark that suggested long observation, and a degree of affection that made the observation forgivable. And the Colonel refused, Mrs. Rudd said. Flatly, Mrs. Clark said. The investment opportunity was, Edwin has always felt, quite sound. There were 3 other parties who subsequently put money in, and 2 of them did reasonably well by it. But the Colonel declined, and he declined in terms that were rather more definitive than the occasion required. He made it clear, I think, that he considered Edwin's judgment questionable. A brief pause. The Colonel can, when he chooses, make a point with some force. It is less agreeable when one is on the receiving end of it. Mrs. Rudd made a sympathetic sound. Miss Marple, quite still against the warm stone of the wall, thought that sympathetic sounds were among the most productive tools of social discourse, requiring nothing but willingness to supply and frequently yielding a great deal in return. Edwin bore it very well. Outwardly, Mrs. Clark continued. That is, I think, rather his way. He is not a man who makes scenes or nurses visible grievances. He has considerable self-possession, and he has always understood that a solicitor in a small village cannot afford to carry his private feelings into his professional relationships. But one knows. The last 2 words were placed with quiet precision, like stones set carefully into a wall. One does know. The voices moved gradually further into the garden as the 2 women walked on, and after another minute or 2 the words became too indistinct to follow. Miss Marple straightened her already straight hat and continued along the lane at her customary pace, thinking about men who bore things very well outwardly, and about what such bearing cost over the course of many years. She had known in her long life a considerable number of people who were skilled at appearing undisturbed. It was frequently a quality that attracted admiration, and not without reason. There was genuine discipline involved, and genuine dignity. But she had also observed that such discipline, when maintained over too long a period in respect of too substantial an injury, had a tendency to exact payment eventually. The mechanism might be different from person to person. Some grew cold, some became excessively cheerful, and some channeled their suppressed feeling into areas of life entirely unrelated to the original wound. But the underlying principle was as reliable as anything in human nature, which was to say, considerably more reliable than most things. The Colonel had refused a business proposal, and had done so unkindly. That was one piece. The clerk's household arrangements were, by common understanding in the village, partly dependent upon the income Edwin Clark drew from managing the Mayhew estate. That was another piece, placed some time ago and not yet fully examined. The wisteria gave off its faint, sweet residue of scent as Miss Marple turned the corner, and she thought of how entirely pleasant the garden behind that wall would be at this hour, in this light, and of how a woman might walk through such a garden and speak quite freely, under the comfortable assumption that the lane outside was empty. She called upon Mrs. Dorothy Harker late that afternoon, ostensibly to return a pattern book borrowed some weeks previously. Mrs. Harker was a woman of vigorous social energy, considerable warmth, and a conversational style that moved at some speed through a wide variety of subjects, occasionally pausing at one of them long enough to deposit something genuinely useful. Miss Marple had found her, over the years, an invaluable if unwitting source of context. They sat in the Harkers' somewhat over-furnished sitting room with their tea, and Mrs. Harker had covered in swift succession the matter of her niece's engagement, the regrettable decline of the Women's Institute flower arranging committee, and the peculiar behaviour of the new family at Elm Cottage, before arriving, with the natural momentum of a well-launched vessel, at Thursday's gathering. "Poor Colonel Brentwood," she said, with genuine concern that was only slightly enlivened by interest. "One does hope it was nothing more than a warm afternoon. Though I thought he looked rather grey before he left. My Arthur always says a grey colour means the digestion, though his ability to diagnose on the basis of colour has not, I must say, been consistently borne out." "He is quite recovered," Miss Marple said. "Oh, I'm glad. Mrs. Mayhew must have been mortified. She takes such trouble with her Thursdays, though she did seem—" Mrs. Harker paused, and in her pause Miss Marple recognised the particular hesitation of a naturally generous person on the threshold of an observation that does not entirely reflect well on its subject. "I don't quite know how to put it. She seemed more put out than distressed, if you follow me. When the Colonel complained, there was something rather clipped about her response. She reached for a biscuit with the air of someone who has said more than they intended, and is now finding their footing again. Though I may have imagined it entirely. The light was rather strong from the window." "It was a warm afternoon," Miss Marple agreed, with the comfortable finality of a woman filing something away. She walked home in the long golden slant of the early evening, through lanes that smelled of warm dust and flowering privet. She thought about clipped responses and visible irritation, and about Mrs. Mayhew standing at the far end of the tea-table, her back partly turned to the sideboard and its single remaining cup. She thought about the nature of dependence and the subtler nature of alliance, and she thought, as she turned in at her own gate, that resentment very rarely confined itself to only one party. It had, in her observation, a way of distributing itself quite thoroughly through all the arrangements it touched, like strong tea left too long in the pot, which eventually made everything it came into contact with rather bitter. Chapter 5. An inheritance long anticipated. Sunday in St. Mary Mead was, as a rule, a day of surfaces, of well-pressed clothes and civil greetings outside the church porch, of luncheons taken at the proper hour, and of afternoons that presented themselves as restful, while quietly accommodating a great deal of careful social navigation. Miss Marple attended the morning service with her customary regularity, exchanged words with the vicar about the state of the East Window Fund, and made her way home through the churchyard by the longer path, which took her past the older graves and provided, as it always had, a useful interval for reflection. She had been turning over, with increasing attention, the matter of Colonel Brentwood's will. The information had reached her, as so much useful information did, by a route that was apparently indirect and actually quite reliable. Old Mrs. Pemberton, who occupied the pew immediately behind Miss Marple every Sunday, and whose hearing was, in inverse proportion to her stated opinion of it, exceptionally acute, had leaned forward during the vestry collection with a remark about the Colonel that she prefaced, as she prefaced most of her more substantial observations, with the assurance that she was not one to repeat things. The Colonel had, it appeared, recently made alterations to his will. The details were not, of course, widely known. Mrs. Pemberton was careful to establish this, but her late husband had been a man of business with connections to the same firm that handled the Brentwood affairs, and one encountered people at certain occasions who mentioned things without quite intending to, and one retained what one heard because one was not, after all, entirely without faculties yet. The substance of it was this: a charitable trust, recently established in connection with a military institution to which the Colonel had long been attached, had been made the principal beneficiary of a quite considerable estate at the expense of certain private arrangements that had previously been understood to exist. Miss Marple had thanked Mrs. Pemberton for the hymn book she had not in fact required, and walked home thinking about understood arrangements and the people who relied upon them. After luncheon, she permitted herself the small indulgence of an armchair and the Sunday papers, but her attention did not, in any very sustained way, engage with their contents. She was thinking instead about Edwin Clarke, about his position, his history, and the particular vulnerability that attaches to a man whose professional respectability has come, over many years, to rest upon a small number of long-standing relationships. Such a man was not, strictly speaking, dependent upon any single client, but the loss of a significant one could alter the landscape of his practice considerably, and the loss of an anticipated advisory role in the management of a substantial estate, a role, Miss Marple imagined, that had been spoken of informally, perhaps even confidently over the course of years, would be felt not merely in financial terms. It would be felt as a judgment. She thought also about Mrs. Eleanor Mayhew, whose household management she had always admired in the abstract and was now examining with somewhat closer attention. The Mayhew estate, such as it was, had been managed since Gerald Mayhew's death by Edwin Clarke. This was common knowledge, and had never been remarked upon as anything other than a perfectly natural arrangement between a competent solicitor and a widow who had no inclination to trouble herself with investment portfolios and tenancy agreements. What was less commonly discussed, but not entirely unknown, was that the income generated through these arrangements represented for Clarke a not inconsiderable portion of his annual practice revenue, and for Mrs. Mayhew the continuation of competent, discreet management by a man who had known her husband's affairs for 30 years represented a form of security that went beyond the merely financial. Each, in other words, had reason to value the arrangement, and each, therefore, has had reason to find the Colonel's revised will, which removed Clarke from a prospective advisory role, and with it a future stream of income and influence, rather more than a matter of passing inconvenience. Miss Marple set aside the Sunday papers and took up her knitting. The pattern she was working on was a simple one. She found, on days that required sustained thought, that simple patterns were preferable to complex ones, as the hands could proceed without demanding the attention that the mind required elsewhere. She was interrupted at about 3 o'clock by a visitor. It was Mrs. Mayhew herself who appeared at the front gate, dressed for an afternoon call with the meticulous appropriateness that characterized all her public appearances, and carrying a small pot of conserve, which she presented with the explanation that she had been making rather too much this season, and that Miss Marple had once mentioned a fondness for damson. Miss Marple had in fact mentioned this. She noted that Mrs. Mayhew had remembered it. They sat in the sitting room, and Agnes, Miss Marple's own daily help, a stout and reliable woman named Mrs. Birch, who bore no relation to Mrs. Mayhew's Agnes, brought tea, and the conversation proceeded through its preliminary passages with the smooth ease of two women who had been exchanging calls for many years and understood the conventions perfectly. It was Mrs. Mayhew who introduced the Colonel's name, and she did so with the slight over-casualness of someone who has been deciding, for the duration of the walk over, precisely how to introduce it. "I have been meaning to inquire after Colonel Brentwood," she said, accepting her cup with a composed hand. "I felt quite dreadful about Thursday. I do hope he has not been inconvenienced." "Quite recovered," Miss Marple said, "for the third time in as many days. His daughter was very attentive." "Miss Cecily is a capable young woman," Mrs. Mayhew said, with a nod that conveyed respect and something that might, in another light, have read as wariness. "The Colonel is fortunate in her." "He is," Miss Marple agreed. She mentioned that he has been somewhat preoccupied of late. Various matters of business, she believed. One imagines a man of his position accumulates a certain quantity of administrative concerns as he gets older. Mrs. Mayhew's cup met its saucer with a precision that was perhaps fractionally more deliberate than the occasion required. "I believe he has been putting his affairs in order," she said. "It is a sensible thing at his age." She looked towards the window, where the garden was conducting itself in the mild, uncomplicated manner of an English Sunday afternoon, though one sometimes wishes the process were managed with a little more consultation. "It can be difficult," Miss Marple said, keeping her voice entirely sympathetic, when arrangements one had understood to be settled are altered without prior discussion. It creates a sense of imbalance. "Precisely," Mrs. Mayhew said, with a quickness that she then visibly moderated. "Not that one has any right to expect consultation, of course. A man's private arrangements are entirely his own affair." She produced this last sentiment with the firmness of someone who has said the correct thing and intends to leave it there, regardless of the fact that the preceding two sentences had said something rather different. Miss Marple remarked on the conserve, which was excellent. He has allowed the conversation to migrate towards the upcoming village fete, and the perennial question of whether the tombola or the plant stall generated more reliable revenue. Mrs. Mayhew contributed views on both subjects with every appearance of restored equanimity, and the visit concluded at 4 o'clock with the mutual goodwill appropriate to a Sunday afternoon call between neighbours of long standing. After she'd gone, Miss Marple sat for a little while in the afternoon quiet, her knitting in her lap and the damson conserve on the table beside her, catching the last of the sunlight in its dark, jewelled way. She thought about a word Mrs. Mayhew had used, consultation, and about what precisely it revealed, positioned as it had been between the acknowledgement of a right she disavowed and the feeling she clearly possessed. She thought about the particular unease of a woman who has relied upon an arrangement and found it, without warning, removed from beneath her, and she thought about how dependence, when it could not speak its own name, had a way of finding expression through other channels entirely. The knitting needles moved through their small, regular arcs. Outside, a blackbird in the apple tree began its evening song, untroubled by inheritance or alliance or the slow, complicated business of human obligation. Miss Marple listened to it for quite some time before going in. Chapter 6. Sugar Measured Too Carefully. Monday brought low cloud and the faint, indecisive drizzle that English summers produce with such apologetic frequency, as though the weather wished to rain properly, but could not quite commit to the undertaking. Miss Marple spent the morning indoors, writing letters and making notes in the small, precise hand she had used for as long as she could remember. She was not, strictly speaking, keeping a record of events. She was simply clarifying her thoughts on paper, which she had always found more reliable than keeping them only in her head, where they were subject to the distortions of mood and the unreliable editing of sleep. She wrote down what she knew, which was rather less than she suspected, and what she suspected, which was considerably more than she could yet support. Between the two columns there remained a gap that she was not yet in a position to close, but the gap was narrowing, and she had learned, over many years of attending to such things, that gaps of this particular kind had a way of closing of their own accord if one remained patient and kept one's attention in the right direction. The drizzle had not relented by mid-morning, but Miss Marple put on her mackintosh and walked to Mayhew House nonetheless. She had sent a note the previous evening, by way of Mrs. Birch's youngest, who obliged with small errands in exchange for a modest consideration and an occasional piece of cake, requesting permission to collect a recipe that Mrs. Mayhew had mentioned some weeks ago. It was a recipe for a particularly good lemon curd, and Miss Marple did genuinely want it. The fact that it also provided a legitimate occasion for a return visit to Mayhew House was an additional convenience that she did not feel required apology. Agnes admitted her with the composed efficiency of a well-trained housemaid and installed her in the sitting room while she went to find Mrs. Mayhew. The room was as orderly as Miss Marple remembered it, everything in its place, every surface maintained with the quiet authority of a household run to exacting standards. There were no stray newspapers, no half-finished pieces of work left out, no casual accumulation of the sort that gives most people's sitting rooms their inhabited quality. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a room that presented itself rather than revealed itself. She had a few minutes alone, and she used them as she always did, by sitting quite still and looking about her with the mild, unfocused expression of a woman who is resting her eyes. The sideboard where the Colonel's cup had stood was visible from where she sat. It was, of course, perfectly clear now, polished, orderly, without a trace of the previous Thursday's arrangement. The cup itself was presumably restored to its companions in the china cabinet along the far wall. Whatever had clung to its inner rim had been, by this time, thoroughly attended to. She was looking at the sideboard when Agnes returned, slightly ahead of Mrs. Mayhew, to deposit a small tray of coffee things and inquire about Miss Marple's mackintosh. "Agnes," Miss Marple said, accepting the offer of coffee with genuine pleasure and surrendering the mackintosh with equal willingness. I believe you were on duty last Thursday when Colonel Brentwood was taken unwell." "Yes, ma'am." Agnes was perhaps 24, with a round, honest face and the careful manner of a girl who has been taught to be respectful and has not yet found reason to question the instruction. She paused, the mackintosh over her arm, with the slight uncertainty of someone who is not sure whether a question has been completed or is only beginning. "I imagine it was rather a disruption to the clearing," Miss Marple said, in a tone of such domestic sympathy that it might have come from one housewife to another. "A gathering always generates a great deal of tidying, and any interruption to the usual routine makes the whole thing more complicated." "It does rather, ma'am," Agnes said, with the relieved warmth of someone finding an unexpectedly congenial topic. "And with the cups needing to go back before the Thursday napkins were counted, I was already a little behind." "I noticed the one cup still out when I left," Miss Marple said. "I nearly mentioned it, and then thought you would no doubt attend to it in your own order." "Mrs. Mayhew told me to leave it," Agnes said, and then produced the slight, careful pause of a person who is about to add something, and is briefly assessing whether it is appropriate to do so. She concluded, apparently, that it was. "She said she would see to it herself," which I thought was a little unusual, if you'll excuse me saying so. Mrs. Mayhew doesn't generally see to the cups herself. She said this without any implication beyond the factual, as one who simply notes that a thing has departed from its established pattern. "I'm sure she had her reasons," Miss Marple said agreeably. "Oh, and before you go, I have been puzzling over something quite small, and you may be able to help me. I understand that Mrs. Mayhew prepared the teapot herself on Thursday, which I gather she does not always do. I imagine she has particular views about the strength of the brew." Agnes was apparently considering how to answer this when the sound of Mrs. Mayhew's step in the hall resolved the question by removing its audience. Agnes departed with the mackintosh and the alert, self-containing quality of a young woman who has said rather more than she expected to, and not quite as much as she might have. Mrs. Mayhew entered with the recipe card already in hand and the pleasant composure of a hostess who has moved comfortably from one call to the next. She offered coffee, expressed mild regret about the weather, and sat down with the settled manner of a woman on familiar ground. Miss Marple accepted the recipe with genuine appreciation, remarked on the consistency required for a really reliable lemon curd, and allowed the conversation to find its own level before observing, in the same domestic register she had established with Agnes, that she had always envied households where the tea was consistently well made. "It requires attention," Mrs. Mayhew agreed. "I'm afraid I have standards that Agnes, for all her good qualities, does not always quite meet when left entirely to her own judgment. The water must be at the right temperature, the measure of leaf must be precise, and the pot itself must be properly warmed." She said this with the mild authority of a woman discussing a subject on which she is entirely confident, and with no apparent awareness that she had confirmed, in passing, that she had indeed prepared the pot herself. "I suppose on Thursday there was rather a great deal to oversee all at once," Miss Marple said. "There was," Mrs. Mayhew said. "The new sandwiches from the bakery were not quite what I had ordered, which meant a last-minute adjustment, and one of the chairs from the dining room needed to be brought through. Agnes managed perfectly well with the sandwiches and the chair, but I preferred to see to the tea things myself." She paused, and some alteration moved through her expression. Not alarm precisely, but the kind of recalibration that occurs in an intelligent person who has heard their own words from a slight distance and is assessing what they have said. "As I do from time to time," she added. "The sugar bowl was very pretty," Miss Marple said, which was true. "I noticed it particularly." "It was my mother's," Mrs. Mayhew said, and the warmth this produced appeared entirely unguarded. "The complete set was a wedding gift. One cannot replace that kind of thing." Miss Marple admired the recipe, finished her coffee, and took her leave at the appropriate moment, here retrieving her mackintosh from Agnes in the hall, and departing through the drizzle with the unhurried step of a woman returning home to a domestic morning. She walked back through the village by way of the pharmacy, where she purchased nothing of any consequence, and the post office, where she posted 3 letters. She was thinking, as she moved through the damp grey-green landscape of a Monday in June, about what it meant to prepare a teapot personally on an afternoon when other things also required attention, and about what it meant to prepare the sugar bowl alongside it. The Colonel rarely took sugar. That had been firmly established, and yet he had accepted it on Thursday without comment or hesitation, at a moment when the cup being offered to him had already, she was increasingly certain, been arranged in a particular way. Which suggested, Miss Marple thought, pressing the post office door open against the mild resistance of a swollen hinge, that the sugar had not in fact been the significant element. It had been the preparation of the cup itself. The sugar had been incidental, or rather, it had served as the mechanism by which a cup already waiting could be directed to its intended recipient without drawing attention to the directing. She walked on through the drizzle, her mind arranging and rearranging the pieces with the patience of long practice, until the gate of her own cottage appeared ahead of her, and the smell of Mrs. Birch's Monday soup came to meet her through the damp air, warm and entirely welcome. Chapter 7. A Hand. Trembling at the saucer. The drizzle persisted through Monday evening and into Tuesday morning, and then, with the characteristic unreliability of English summer weather, cleared entirely by 10 o'clock to produce an afternoon of such crystalline brightness that the village appeared freshly rinsed and rather pleased about it. The roses along the high street dripped and glittered. The pavement steamed gently in the returning warmth. Even the war memorial, which tended towards a certain austerity of expression in all weathers, seemed fractionally less severe in the particular quality of Tuesday's light. Miss Marple had been waiting, with no outward appearance of impatience, for the right occasion to return to Mayhew House a second time. A second call within the same week required a reason that would present itself as natural rather than purposeful, and she had known from long experience that such reasons could not always be manufactured. They had to be allowed to arrive. On Tuesday morning, the reason arrived in the form of a pair of gloves. They were perfectly good gloves, cream cotton, suitable for summer calls, and Miss Marple had left them, with entire deliberateness, on the small table near the door of Mrs. Mayhew's sitting-room during her Monday visit. She had placed them there at the moment of departing, with the practised absent-mindedness of someone whose mind is genuinely elsewhere, which in a sense it had been, though not in the direction anyone might have supposed. She sent a brief note by way of Mrs. Birch's youngest, explaining about the gloves and expressing hope that she was not inconveniencing anyone, and received in return a message from Agnes to say that the gloves had indeed been found and that Miss Marple was welcome to collect them at any convenient time that afternoon. Mayhew, Agnes added, was engaged with a committee meeting in the village hall until 4 o'clock, which Miss Marple found most satisfactory. It was, after all, the house, rather than its mistress, she chiefly wished to revisit. She arrived at 2:30. Agnes received her with the pleasant efficiency she always brought to her duties, and went to retrieve the gloves from the hall table where they had been placed for safekeeping. This left Miss Marple alone in the entrance hall for a period of some 3 minutes, which was precisely what she required. The entrance hall of Mayhew House was not in itself a room of great character. It served its purpose as a transitional space, practical, well-ordered, smelling faintly of beeswax and the potpourri that Mrs. Mayhew kept in a small china bowl near the coat stand. The door to the sitting room stood open, and from where Miss Marple positioned herself, apparently occupied with the adjustment of her hat in the mirror above the hall table, she had a clear view of the sideboard against the far wall. The sideboard was empty and immaculate, as it had been on Monday. But it was not the sideboard itself that held her attention on this occasion. It was the cup, the Colonel's cup. She was nearly certain it was the same one, by the particular arrangement of the blue and white pattern that she had noted on Thursday, was now returned to the china cabinet with its companions. But in the interval since her Monday visit, one small detail had altered. The cabinet door, which had been fully latched on Monday, was now resting at the merest fraction open, in the manner of a door not so much left ajar as improperly closed. And the cup in question had been moved from its previous position, third from the left on the lower shelf, to the far right of the upper shelf, separated from its nearest neighbour by a small deliberate distance. Miss Marple did not move towards the cabinet. She simply observed it, as she had observed it, with the patient, receptive attention of someone who understands that the most informative things are frequently those that others have not thought to conceal, because they did not recognise them as informative. Agnes returned with the gloves, and Miss Marple accepted them with warm gratitude, and the observation that she was becoming quite hopelessly forgetful, which Agnes politely contradicted. As she was shown out, Miss Marple paused at the door and said, in a tone of the mildest possible inquiry, that she hoped the Colonel's cup had not been damaged in all the business of Thursday. Agnes looked at her with the brief, yet assessing expression of a young woman receiving a question that is slightly unexpected. "The cup, ma'am?" "The one that was set aside on the sideboard. I noticed it when I left on Thursday, and I confess I wondered afterwards whether there had been a crack." "Mrs. Mayhew is very particular about her china." "I don't believe it was cracked, ma'am," Agnes said, with a shade of uncertainty. "Mrs. Mayhew had a look at it herself on Friday morning. I saw her with it at the kitchen sink, just before I came in. She said it was quite all right and I was to put it away with the others," a pause of the small and thoughtful kind, "though she did rinse it out herself, which she doesn't usually do with the china." "No," Miss Marple said, "I shouldn't imagine she does." She walked home with her gloves and her thoughts, and spent the remainder of the afternoon in the garden, where the sweet peas had recovered their composure after the overnight rain, and were proceeding with renewed ambition up their supports. She was thinking about the kitchen sink on Friday morning, and about what it meant to rinse a cup personally, rather than leaving it to Agnes. She was thinking, too, about what she had observed at the gathering itself. The Colonel's cup, his hand reaching for it, and the moment, which she now replayed with the careful deliberation of a scene examined in better light, when she had seen a slight tremor at his saucer as he raised it. She had attributed it, on Thursday, to the unsteadiness that could come with age and a warm afternoon. The Colonel was 70, or thereabouts, and the tremor of an older hand lifting a full teacup was not in itself remarkable. But she found herself revisiting it now with the particular attention she brought to things that had passed once without fully registering, and were presenting themselves again for reconsideration. The tremor had come not at the lifting, but at the setting down. After he had drunk, in the moment before his expression had altered to that confused, displeased look she had noted across the room, and his hand, she thought, had not so much trembled as recoiled, fractionally, and almost immediately corrected, as though something in the cup had struck him with an unpleasantness that was more specific than mere nausea. On Wednesday morning, Miss Marple called upon Dr. James Aldridge. Dr. Aldridge was a capable man in his mid-50s, with a directness of manner that his patients sometimes found brisk and Miss Marple had always found efficient. He was also, she had long since established, a man who took his professional obligations seriously, but was not above a quietly informative conversation with an observant older woman who asked questions in the right way. She raised the matter of the Colonel's indisposition without preamble, which she knew Dr. Aldridge would prefer to a more circuitous approach. She mentioned the bitter taste, the nausea, the relatively swift recovery, and the quinine comparison the Colonel had offered to his daughter. She did not mention the cup or its subsequent handling. She simply asked, in the tone of a woman satisfying an old person's natural anxiety about a neighbour's health, whether such symptoms might arise from something as simple as an accidental ingestion, a substance in the wrong quantity, or perhaps a tonic of some kind. Dr. Aldridge regarded her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been asked an apparently innocent question, and is considering whether it is in fact innocent, and his conclusion apparently was that it was close enough. Certain digestive tonics, he said, taken in an unaccustomed dose can produce precisely that. Nausea, a sharp bitter taste, rapid onset and equally rapid resolution. Harmless in small amounts, quite unpleasant in the short term. The quinine analogy is not inaccurate. There are one or two preparations still in fairly common household use. He paused. It would be virtually undetectable in a strong-flavoured tea. Yes, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. I rather imagined it might be. She thanked him, declined his offer of a chair, and walked home through an afternoon that was by now warm and very clear. She was thinking about preparations in common household use, and about a woman who had personally prepared a teapot and personally rinsed a cup, and about the particular care that is taken over things one does not wish to be examined. The substance, she was now quite satisfied, had been real. The intent she had come to believe was something other than harm. But intent and consequence were not always the same thing, and in the gap between them, that narrow, complicated distance, lay the whole of the matter she now needed to resolve. Chapter 8. Accounts from a Seaside Season. Wednesday afternoon brought with the generosity that fine English summer days occasionally display when one has ceased to expect them. A warmth that was neither oppressive nor apologetic, but simply pleasant. The kind of afternoon that invites one outdoors without demanding it, and rewards the garden visitor with the particular satisfaction of warmth, earned by preceding cold. Where Miss Marple took her knitting to the garden bench and sat for a while in a manner that appeared entirely idle and was in fact the opposite. She had been thinking about Edwin Clarke with increasing particularity, and she had arrived by the slow but reliable method of sustained consideration at a question she could not answer from her own knowledge. It concerned the summer. She believed it was some 15 or 16 years ago now, when the Colonel had been rather more visible in the social life of the village than he subsequently became. He had been, in those years, not yet retired, but making the visits to his family home in St. Mary Mead that preceded the permanent return of his later life. It was during one of those summers, she seemed to recall, that some public unpleasantness had occurred in connection with Edwin Clarke and a matter of investment. She had been aware of it at the time, in the peripheral way one is aware of difficulties that do not directly concern oneself, and had not attended to it with any particular care because there had seemed no reason to do so. Now she found she wished she had attended to it more closely. The person most likely to recall the details, she reflected, was old Mr. Haverstock. Mr. Aubrey Haverstock was 83, lived in a small but well-preserved house at the edge of the village, and possessed a memory that had declined, in his own word, magnificently, retaining with perfect clarity everything that had occurred before approximately 1935 and releasing with equal thoroughness most of what had happened since. He was also, when approached with the appropriate combination of patience and interest, an extremely engaging companion. Miss Marple had always found visits to Mr. Haverstock both informative and genuinely enjoyable, which was not a combination she took for granted. She telephoned ahead, walked over at 3 o'clock with a small portion of Mrs. Birch's Tuesday cake, and found him installed in his garden chair in a posture of dignified repose, apparently communing with the middle distance in a manner that might have been philosophical, or might equally have been a brief and restorative nap. He rallied, in any case, with satisfying promptness when she appeared at the gate. They settled on either side of a small iron table, and Mr. Haverstock accepted the cake with the frank appreciation of a man whose household did not produce very much of it. He inquired after Miss Marple's garden with the interest of a former gardener who has relinquished active participation without relinquishing opinion, and they discussed the sweet peas at some length and with mutual pleasure before arriving, by the natural drift of conversation, at more recent matters. "I have been trying to remember," Miss Marple said, when the cake had been sufficiently appreciated. "A summer, I think it was perhaps 16 years ago or thereabouts, when Colonel Brentwood was in the village for some weeks. He was still in the service then. There was some sort of difficulty, I believe, connected with a business proposal, and Edwin Clark's name was mentioned in connection with it. Mr. And Haverstock set down his fork with the decisiveness of a man to whom something has been said that does not require any prompting to recall. The Sandgate affair, he said immediately. Yes, that was, let me see, the summer of the Hendersons' silver wedding, because I remember the conversation occurred at their garden party. 19 years ago, I should think, not 16, he considered. Or 17. The years compress. They do, Miss Marple agreed. What was the nature of it? If you remember? Oh, I remember perfectly, Mr. Haverstock said, with the mild satisfaction of a man exercising a faculty he prizes. Clark had been promoting an investment scheme, perfectly above board, as far as anyone could establish, though it came to nothing in the end, in connection with some commercial property development at the coast. Sandgate, hence the name. Several local men had put money in on his recommendation, and when the development fell through and the investors lost what they had put in, there was a certain amount of ill feeling, as there generally is in such cases. He paused to accept a second piece of cake, which Miss Marple had anticipated and accordingly brought in sufficient quantity. The Colonel had been approached, Mr. Haverstock continued, settling back with the ease of a man well into a congenial topic, and had declined, which was, in retrospect, the sensible decision. Although it was not presented as such at the time, he had declined, and he had said so, at the Hendersons' party in front of rather a large number of people, in terms that made it perfectly clear he considered Clark's recommendation to have been, at best, imprudent. He used the word credulous, if I recall correctly, applied to the men who had invested on Clark's advice. A brief pause. It was not, on the whole, a kind thing to say. The men in question were present. And Mr. Clark was present, Miss Marple said. Edwin Clark was standing not 4 feet away, Mr. Haverstock said. I was standing rather closer to the lemonade table and had a clear view of the whole thing. Clark's expression did not alter by so much as a line. He made some civil remark about differing judgments and moved away to speak to someone else. It was, I thought at the time, quite remarkably well done. The kind of composure that is not natural, but has been very carefully acquired. He looked at Miss Marple with the acute, undimmed eyes of a very old man. I have always thought that the more perfectly a person conceals a wound in company, the more thoroughly they feel it in private. That has been my observation as well, Miss Marple said. Brentwood was not, I think, a cruel man by nature, Mr. Haverstock said, and with the fair-minded deliberation of someone who has considered a person from several angles over many years. He was a man accustomed to speaking with authority, and accustomed to being right, and not always attentive to the effect of his manner on those he considered to have been wrong. There is a type. One meets it, particularly among men who have had command. He smoothed the arm of his garden chair with one weathered hand, a gesture that seemed to belong to some private train of thought. He said what he thought, and he said it clearly, and he moved on. I don't believe he gave it another thought. And Mr. Clark, Edwin Clark, I should say, gave it a great many thoughts, over a great many years. Mr. Haverstock said this without rancour, simply as an observation that his experience of human nature had rendered self-evident. He's not a man who forgets. That is not a criticism, you understand. Forgiving and forgetting are two different operations, and the capacity for the first does not always entail the second. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment, watching a bee move with drowsy certainty among the lavender at the edge of Mr. Haverstock's path. She thought about a summer party, a lemonade table, and a single, carelessly delivered word, credulous, landing in a gathering of people who had acted on Edwin Clark's professional judgment and lost their money by it. She thought about what it cost a solicitor in a small village to have his professional credibility questioned publicly by a man of the Colonel's standing and certainty. The investment itself, she said. Was there ever any suggestion that Clark had behaved improperly? That the advice had been given in bad faith? None whatsoever, Mr. Haverstock said firmly. He had made an error of commercial judgment, as many better men have done before and since. The scheme was ill-conceived, but Clark had not profited from it. It had not misled anyone deliberately, and had lost a small amount of his own money in it as well. He was imprudent, not dishonest. The Colonel's insinuation, such as it was, went rather further than the evidence warranted. He smiled, very slightly. But that is, one finds, rather the nature of public rebukes. They tend to be shaped by the speaker's certainty rather than the full complexity of the situation. Miss Marple thanked him for the tea, which his housekeeper had eventually produced, and for his recollections, which had been, as she had expected, considerably more than satisfactory. She walked home through the village in the long, late light of a June evening, past the church and the mill pond and the ancient yew at the lich gate, thinking about a word spoken at a garden party nearly 2 decades ago, and about the particular tenacity of injuries that have been borne too quietly for too long. The word credulous had been addressed to the investors, but it had reached Edwin Clark, standing 4 feet away, with the accuracy of something aimed. And some things, once aimed and landed, did not simply dissipate with the passage of time. They settled, instead, into the permanent architecture of a life, quiet, invisible, structural, until the occasion arrived at last when they might be answered. Chapter 9. Truth spoken by the window seat. Thursday arrived with the quiet punctuality of a day that has been anticipated for some time, and sees no reason to make a ceremony of its arrival. It was a week to the day since Mrs. Mayhew's gathering, and St. Mary Mead conducted itself with its usual Thursday composure, entirely unaware that Miss Marple had spent a considerable portion of the preceding evening sitting with her knitting untouched in her lap, making a decision. The decision, when she arrived at it, was not dramatic. It rarely was. It was simply the recognition that she had accumulated, over the course of the week, a sufficiency of understanding, not proof in the legal sense, not the kind of material that one placed before an inspector and expected to produce consequences, but understanding of a rather more complete and human kind. She knew, with the confidence of long experience and particular attention, what had happened and why, and she knew, with equal confidence, what ought to be done about it. The two forms of knowledge were not always the same, and in this case they pointed in the same direction. She wrote a brief note to Mr. Edwin Clark that morning, inviting him to call at his convenience, and mentioning that she had a small matter she wished to discuss relating to a village committee matter, which was, if not precisely accurate, at least not entirely untrue, as she did have mild views on the question of the tombola, and had been meaning to express them to someone for several weeks. Mr. Clark replied by return, as she had expected a man of his professional habits would, to say that he would be happy to call at 4 o'clock. He arrived precisely on time, which was also exactly what she had expected. Miss Marple received him in the sitting room, where the afternoon light fell at a warm angle through the west-facing window, and the sweet peas on the mantelpiece were at what she privately considered their finest point of the season. Mrs. Birch had left a tray before departing, and the tea things were arranged with the unpretentious competence that Miss Marple preferred to ceremony. Mr. Clark settled into the chair across from hers with the ease of a man who has called upon neighbours for 40 years and knows how to inhabit a sitting room without occupying too much of it. They spoke for a little while about the tombola, she had as promised views, and about the recent decision regarding the village hall roof, which had been a source of local discussion for several months. Mr. Clark contributed to both topics with his customary measured amiability, and if he noticed that Miss Marple's attention was not entirely given over to either subject, his professional composure did not betray it. It was Miss Marple who shifted the conversation, and she did so without particular preamble, in the manner of someone who has decided that the indirect approach has had its full and proper use, and that what is now required is a different kind of precision entirely. "I have been thinking," she said, setting down her cup with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to most things, "about the Colonel's cup of tea last Thursday." Something moved in Mr. Clark's expression, a very slight, very controlled alteration, like the surface of still water registering a stone that has been placed in it rather than thrown. He said nothing, and his silence was not the silence of surprise, but of a man who has known, with the unfailing instinct of an intelligent person, that this conversation was eventually going to occur. "I think," Miss Marple continued in the same measured, unhurried tone, "that you prepared that cup before the gathering, that you had access to the tea things in Mrs. Mayhew's house, which would not be remarkable, given your long professional association with the household, and that you introduced a small quantity of a digestive preparation into the cup before it was used, something common enough to produce significant discomfort without presenting any medical risk. The quinine bitterness the Colonel described is consistent with that." She paused. "I also think that the intent was never harm, in any serious sense. One does not use a harmless household remedy if harm is the object." Mr. Clark looked at her for a long moment. Outside, a wood-pigeon in the garden called its soft, repetitive note, and the afternoon moved around them in its unhurried way. "You are," he said at last, "a quite remarkably observant woman, Miss Marple." "I have lived in a small village for a very long time," she said. "One accumulates a certain facility." He was quiet again, but it was a different quality of silence now. Not the controlled silence of professional neutrality, but something more personal. He looked towards the window and the garden beyond it, and for a moment the careful, pleasant composure he wore, as habitually as his well-pressed jacket, was set aside, and something more tired and more human was visible in its place. "I want to say first that I am aware of how it appears," he said, "or I'm aware that there is no construction that makes it appear well." He spoke with the precise, slightly formal diction of a man who has spent his career finding exact words for difficult things. "What I did was wrong, not harmful. I was quite certain of that. I am a careful man, and I took very careful precautions, but wrong in itself, regardless of precautions." "Yes," Miss Marple said simply. "The Henderson garden party," he said after a moment. "You know about that." "I spoke with Mr. Haverstock." "Ah," a small rueful acknowledgement. "Aubrey Haverstock has never forgotten anything that took place within his sight." He was quiet for a moment. "I wish I could say that I had put it behind me long ago, that it was a young man's injury, absorbed and resolved in the ordinary way of these things, but I find that is not quite what happened. I thought it was. For many years I thought it was. And then the matter of the will arose, and I found, rather to my own surprise, that it was not." He said this last with the honesty of a person examining himself and reporting accurately, without either excusing the examination or exaggerating its findings. Miss Marple found it, as she generally found honesty both admirable and a little painful. "The will removed something you had understood to be settled," she said. "It removed a professional arrangement that I had, perhaps too comfortably, allowed myself to regard as secure." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at her. "And the Colonel, of course, was not consulted with when making it, and expressed no awareness that the change might have consequence for anyone beyond his own wishes, which is, as you may appreciate, a reasonably familiar pattern." "I do appreciate it," Miss Marple said, "and I think you understand that I am not suggesting the injury was imaginary, or that the Colonel's manner across many years has been without fault." She paused. "But understanding an injury does not make the response to it right." "No," he said, "it does not." The afternoon settled gently around them. Miss Marple refilled his cup, which he accepted with a small movement of genuine gratitude, and she thought about how long a person could carry something. 19 years in this case, not 16 as Mr. Haverstock had recalled, and what the accumulation of that carrying eventually produced. And how it was that a man who had managed to bear a public humiliation with composure in front of a garden party full of witnesses had found himself, nearly 2 decades later, standing over a cup of tea. "I think," she said, with the careful gentleness of someone who means every word, "that an apology would be worth making. Not a formal acknowledgement, nothing that brings the matter into public view, which would serve no one, but a private one, genuinely offered, or on the right occasion." She looked at him steadily. "The Colonel is not, I think, a man incapable of receiving it. He simply requires to understand what he is receiving it for." Mr. Clark looked at her for a long moment, and the tiredness in his expression shifted by 1 degree towards something less weighted. "You are suggesting that he does not know," he said. "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that a man who delivered a word like credulous at a garden party and then moved on to the lemonade table has probably not carried it with him the way you have. People rarely do, with injuries they have given." She said this not unkindly, but with the plain certainty of very long observation, which is in itself perhaps the most maddening thing. "Yes," Mr. Clark said quietly. "Yes, I believe that is precisely it." The wood pigeon called again. The sweet peas stood in their evening light. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, and after a moment Mr. Clark picked up his tea, and they sat together in the warm, ordinary Thursday afternoon for a little while longer before he took his leave. Chapter 10. The teapot poured out. The following Thursday arrived in the manner of all days that carry a mild significance. Quietly, without announcement, wearing the same ordinary face as the Thursday before it. The roses along the lane had shed their first flush and were composing themselves for the second. The air smelled of warm stone and cut grass, and the village moved through its morning with the unhurried certainty of a place that has been doing precisely this for a very long time and expects to continue. Miss Marple had heard, through the reliable medium of Mrs. Birch's morning conversation, that there had been a call made at Mayhew House on Tuesday. Mr. Clark had gone, it appeared, in the early afternoon, and had stayed for the better part of an hour. Whether this information had reached Mrs. Birch by way of Agnes, or by some other tributary of the village's remarkably comprehensive intelligence network, Miss Marple did not inquire. She simply noted it, as she noted most things, and allowed it to settle into its proper place alongside everything else she knew. She attended Mrs. Mayhew's Thursday gathering at 3:30. The room was arranged as it always was, the lace cloth, the silver teapot, the plates of sandwiches distributed with the precision that Mrs. Mayhew considered appropriate to the occasion. Agnes moved about her duties with the quiet efficiency that had been one of the more reliable constants of the afternoon. The guests arrived in their usual order, which was to say that Mrs. Harker arrived slightly early, and Mr. and Mrs. Clark arrived together at precisely the correct time, which Miss Marple had always privately considered a form of social courtesy, elevated to a minor art. Colonel Brentwood came in at 3:20, and his daughter Cecily at his side, and positioned himself in the chair by the window, with the comfortable authority of a man who's been well for 10 days, and has consequently revised downward his estimation of how ill he had been. He was ruddy, forthright, and in excellent spirits, and accepted his tea from Agnes with the ease of a man who has not given the matter any particular thought. It was Earl Grey. Agnes had confirmed, in response to a question she apparently considered entirely unremarkable, that the Colonel's preference remained on record. Miss Marple settled into her customary chair near the fireplace, the fire unlit this week, the weather having rendered it superfluous, and observed the room with the mild, receptive attention she brought to all such occasions. She noted that Mrs. Mayhew, receiving her guests with her usual composed authority, paused for just a fraction of a moment when Mr. Clark arrived. It was not an uncomfortable pause, and it would not have been visible to anyone who was not looking for it. It was the pause of a woman who has had a conversation that rearranged something she had understood, and who is still, quietly, accommodating the rearrangement. Mr. Clark himself greeted Mrs. Mayhew with the same measured pleasantness he extended to everyone, and if something between them had shifted by 1 or 2 degrees in the interval since the previous week, it had done so in the way that significant shifts between people of their particular temperament generally did, without drama, without declaration, almost invisibly, like the settling of a wall that has borne too much weight for too long and has been quietly repointed in the night. Cecily Brentwood found Miss Marple's chair some 20 minutes into the gathering, under the pretext of admiring the arrangement of the sweet peas, which Miss Marple had brought as her contribution to the afternoon, and which were, she thought immodestly, looking particularly well. "Father is in very good form," Cecily said, in a voice calibrated to the moderate ambience of the room. "He is," Miss Marple agreed. "The June air suits him." Cecily was quiet for a moment, in the particular way of someone who has something further to say, and is deciding how to say it. He and Mr. Clark had a brief exchange just before tea, in the garden. While the others were still arriving, I was not near enough to hear it. She looked at Miss Marple with her clear, direct gaze. Father came in afterwards with the expression he wears when he has said something he considers handsome, and has not found the exercise as uncomfortable as he anticipated. "Some conversations," Miss Marple said, accepting a sandwich from Agnes's passing tray with a small nod of thanks, "are a good deal easier than one expects, particularly when they are brief and do not require anyone to go into detail." "I imagine that is a considerable relief for everyone involved," Cecily said. "Generally speaking," Miss Marple said, "it is." Cecily returned to her father's side with the satisfaction of a woman who has confirmed what she suspected, and finds the confirmation agreeable, and Miss Marple remained in her chair, and let the afternoon proceed around her in its familiar, comfortable way. Mrs. Harker offered an account of a peculiar occurrence involving the post office, and a misdirected parcel that occupied several minutes most agreeably. Mrs. Clark said something precise and apt about the village hall curtains. The Colonel told an anecdote about a horse that had nothing whatsoever to do with anything that had preceded it, and everyone listened with the indulgent attention accorded to men of his age and standing. Towards the end of the gathering, when the tea things had been refreshed and the conversation had reached that pleasantly diffuse stage that signals the approaching hour of departure, Miss Marple found herself looking at the silver teapot in the middle of the table. Steam rose from its spout in the slow, wavering way of steam that has reached a satisfactory temperature and is in no particular hurry. The cups were distributed and filled and set down and lifted again, and Agnes moved through the room with her tray in the ordinary choreography of a Thursday well in hand. Nothing, on the surface of things, had changed. The room was as it had always been. The people in it were as they had always appeared. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, something had been resolved. Not loudly, not conclusively, not in any way that would be apparent to a casual observer or reported in any record, but resolved nonetheless, in the quiet, particular manner of things that are settled not by confrontation, but by understanding. She had thought, more than once during the past week, about what it meant to administer a harmless discomfort, with the intention of making someone feel, briefly, what one had felt oneself for 19 years. It was not a defensible act, and she had said so plainly, and Mr. Clark had agreed plainly, and that was what honesty between people of reasonable intelligence looked like when it was properly managed. But she had also thought about the Colonel, about a word delivered without attention to its landing, in front of people for whom its landing mattered, and never once revisited. And she found that her understanding, while it could not excuse the cup, could accommodate the 19 years with a degree of sympathy that she did not think it dishonest to feel. People, in her experience, were not simple. They did not divide cleanly into those who had behaved well and those who had not. They were, rather, people with old injuries and habitual defences and moments in which the patient architecture of their self-possession was found, upon closer examination, to have been under rather greater strain than it appeared. The remarkable thing was not that such moments occurred, but that they were generally in the end manageable. She accepted the last of her tea and set the cup down with the gentle finality of a woman whose afternoon has been entirely satisfactory. People, she remarked quietly, to no one in particular, though Cecily, who had returned to the chair beside her, inclined her head with the attentiveness of someone who expects the remark to be worth hearing, may forgive words in time, but they rarely forget the memory of feeling small. She paused, looking at the steam still rising from the teapot in its unhurried column. The kindest thing one can do, I have